The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries for Reality with Shayn Jones.
What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the expanse of deep, open-minded conversation. I'm the one that they call Shane, and today for you guys, I have somebody that I had the privilege of connecting with and actually speaking with when I was at Snarly Yow's Cryptid Halloween 3, and after hearing his presentation, I definitely wanted to have him on the show, and of course, this is his very first podcast, so of course, that is definitely a special place, and it is always an honor to be somebody's first podcast experience. If you guys are from the West Virginia area, or even if you are just interested in the West Virginia area, this guy brings in a lot of history, a lot of folklore, and a lot of the paranormal stuff from the area, so I definitely think you guys are going to enjoy this episode, because as you guys have seen from previous episodes, I definitely like spotlighting specific cities and sharing some of their local folklore. But before we get into this one today, just a couple of new exciting things that I would love to share with you guys. First and foremost, I finally got that computer upgrade that I've been trying to get for a while. And for anybody that's been around for a while, you guys would have noticed that I was doing lives through Patreon, and then that trickled off for a while. And the reasoning for that was because my computer wasn't fast enough to do what I was trying to do anymore. So with that new computer upgrade, what that means for you guys is that I can finally start doing lives again. I can finally start doing lives for Patreon again for all of the regular standard episodes. And also, I can have a lot higher resolution for being able to do video stuff. And there's just going to be a lot more coming down the pipeline now that I got this new computer. So if anybody's interested in being able to hop onto those lives, check out a lot cleaner and nicer looking video content as far as Patreon goes. You guys can always go and check that stuff out. And just know that there's a lot of new stuff in the works. And on the other side, for news and updates, I'm still trying to work on putting together that investigation team. I know I've talked about it in the last few shows, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But if you guys are interested in joining an investigation team in the Metro Detroit area, there is an application down in the show description that you guys can fill out. And I should hopefully be getting back to you guys within the next couple weeks. And the other thing is that I'm still looking for new topics to be able to expand what's talked about on the show. So I know I love diving into cryptids, aliens, UFOs, conspiracies, all that type of stuff, spirituality, but of course, I'm always still interested in having those types of guests on, so if you're somebody who wants to come on and share your experiences or research, definitely get a hold of me. But on the other side, if you're somebody who's been a listener to the show and there's a topic or something that I haven't talked about and you might be interested in hearing it get talked about on the show, shoot me a message and I can hopefully find a guest that might be interested in talking about that. Or on the other side, if you're somebody who does research things and you guys have an idea, a thought, something you guys want to bring into the show, whether it's something that has to do with conspiracies, the occult, philosophy, or honestly any other new topic that should be brought onto the show, I definitely want to hear from you guys. So don't hesitate to get a hold of me through any means that you can possibly find. But before we get into the show, just a quick message. This podcast has a strong focus on community engagement, so I encourage all listeners to share their own experiences and research on the show. That said, if anyone would like to be a guest on the show, or if anybody has an encounter or experience that they would like to share on the show, or possibly even have me investigate, you guys can email me at inquiriesofallrealitypodcast@outlook.com. That email is also available down in the show description off of the link tree, or you guys can give me a call or text on the hotline, and that number is 313-364-1551. And of course, that number is also available down in the show description, so you guys can find it quick and easy. And every single thing that I mention is all available on the link tree, which is available down in the show description. And with that, let's get into the show. please welcome to the show for his very first podcast appearance, somebody that, again, I got to meet at Snarly Owl's Cryptid Halloween, because I always have to give an awesome shout out to Dave every single time I end up having somebody come on the show because of him. Please welcome to the show, Kevin Breeden, a.k.a. the Cemetery Tour Guide. How's it going today?
It's going very well. Thank you for having me. As you said, this is my first go-around.
Well, it's super duper exciting. I always love having somebody on for their first time. I try to keep it really laid back for people, try to make it pretty easy going. So hopefully I can give you a good podcast experience, and then you can pop on and make some more appearances on some other podcasts.
There you go. I'd enjoy that.
Well, considering this is your very first time on a podcast, I'm assuming that a lot of people may not be familiar with you unless they're residents of the Ranson, West Virginia type area. But for anybody out there that may not be familiar about who you are, what you do, why don't you let them know a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what the Cemetery Tour Guide is?
Sure. Well, I was born and raised here in Ranson, West Virginia, over in Jefferson County. I've been a history nut my whole life. And I finally realized one day that the history and the paranormal link up. You can't have one without the other. And that's what brought me over to, quote unquote, the other side. So I do them both. I do history and I do paranormal tours here in town, in Ranson and Charlestown. Some of them are the local houses and one of the schools, our courthouse, two of our cemeteries, and I also roll that over, and I do several history tours of local cemeteries, Antietam Battlefield. I'm just being a history nut. I'm a little bit of everywhere locally.
Well, I always love to spotlight when people like to dig into their local area, do a little bit of the history, do a little bit of the paranormal side. I actually had somebody on that was Spooky CLT from North Carolina, and he dived specifically just into Charlestown, all the history and everything. So I guess an awesome place to start because I love Charlestown. I've been there a handful of times. It's a beautiful place. Why don't we kind of get into where you kind of like to start with the history and kind of dive into the paranormal a little bit with it?
Well, our community, basically, its whole being is John Brown's raid, trial and execution in 1859, and then the American Civil War. That is the two biggest parts of the history of Jefferson County. Now, also, you will run into a lot of the Washington history. Samuel and Charles, who are two brothers of General Washington or President Washington, had homes in our county. So, we are steeped in all this great American history. And then you realize as you're going along that a lot of the stuff at the courthouse and some of the other buildings in town were present during John Brown's trial. And he was executed on Samuel Street, a few blocks from the courthouse. So you begin to realize just how much the community is steeped in all this great history. And then when you start to hear about the paranormal things, it kind of starts to mesh for you. And that's how I got interested into the whole other side of it. I was a Civil War reenactor. And I can tell you that Antietam Battlefield does take on a different life at night. I was a volunteer there for years. My reenactment group did weekends in the park where we talked to the public, did firing demonstrations. We would camp on the battlefield. I'm probably one of the few people in this entire country that's actually slept on a pew in the Dunkard Church, slept in the Bloody Cornfield, slept in Bloody Lane, and slept on Burnside Bridge. And, that within itself was great.
I was going to say, that's super cool.
But then as you're laying there at night, you're hearing things that you can't explain. You recognize them because of the era that you portray, but it shouldn't be going on. And I've said, I think I told you this at Snarly show. I used to feel so sorry for the night ranger because especially during the week, they would get phone calls in the middle of the night. Somebody's up behind my house shooting off cannon. I want it stopped. Well, he's by himself at night usually. They would have to call Hagerstown. They would dispatch either a Washington County deputy sheriff or a Maryland State policeman to back him up. They'd go out behind this residence. They could hear the gun. Every time they would move to the right or the left where they could hear the concussion coming from, it would move the opposite direction. And they'd be out there for hours and never found the field piece that was firing, because there really wasn't a field piece. It was residue from the Battle of Antietam. And I just, that really blew me away. And being a local person, and I was raised by two older parents. My dad was 41 and my mom was 35 when I was born, and I'm 61 now. They grew up around a lot of these stories, and they started to tell me stuff when I was a boy about different homes, different people, different roads, a couple of the old apple orchards out in the county. And I was fascinated. So even as a child, I began to collect these paranormal stories, didn't really have anything to do with them, because at the time I wasn't doing anything as far as being a guide of any type. When I was 16, I started doing some of the history tours in Charlestown, and I did a couple of firing demonstrations with my musket a few times in town, in front of the library for different holidays and stuff that they were recognizing. And then one day, as I say, it just all started to mesh, and it went together for me. And I said, you know what, this makes sense. If this is supposed to be happening in this area at night, well, here's what happened 100 and some odd years ago during the day. It's got to go together. It meshes. So, the courthouse, the old original hospital in Charlestown, there on Congress Street, the old original high school, which is right up from it, which is now Wright Denny, the Rebecca Hunter house, which is just up next to the library. She rented the property that John Brown was executed on. She had a little tiny farm on the edge of town. She rented the property to build the scaffolding to have him executed on. Her home is probably, one of the top three in our area for paranormal activity. And, now it's occupied by the county. In fact, the county commission, that's where their offices are. And I happen to have some friends. A couple have retired, but they worked for the county commission. And just some of the things that went on in there during the daytime, the one lady told me, she said, I didn't realize they don't like change. And I said, well, why is that? She said, well, there were two girls who switched offices. She said, this was on Friday. When we came back to work on Monday morning, all their potted plants were busted up. All the paperwork was all disheveled on their desks. I said, really? She says, and those were the only two offices. I said, well, yeah, it's always been my understanding that spirits don't like change. They like things the way they are. And in our cemeteries, the Episcopal churchyard, I've never personally heard it, but I understand you can hear the organ playing at night in the organ loft. John Yates Bell, who was a spy for the Confederacy, who was executed at Governor's Island, New York in February of 1865. In fact, that the 160th anniversary of that's getting ready to come up. I've done his grave so much that I actually, and not being disrespectful, but I actually lean a little bit on his headstone, because I've talked so much about the man that I feel like I actually knew him. And I was doing a Halloween tour, and his grave, you're facing this way, but the way the other stones are laid out, most people stand on a little bit of an angle to me this way. And I noticed they were looking off in the distance towards the wall of the cemetery. And Shayn, I said, damn, I don't have it tonight. They're not even paying any attention to me. And one of them stepped forward and said, look over your left shoulder. And there's a small little tree there with a fork in it. And when you turn, you're looking right through the fork. And there was a shadow on the wall about your size. And as soon as I looked at it, it shot back up the cemetery. And also, I've been there, and you hear footsteps and leaves, yet we're all standing still. I've sent people out of the cemetery because it's right on the corner. Sent them out of the cemetery to look on Church Street and on Congress Street to see if anybody was walking up down the street, and it's brick streets. Nobody was there. So, it's really amazed me how much was there that I already knew about, but how much more there was to it. And once I started finding all this stuff out, I was hooked.
Hold on tight, everyone. Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break. But if you don't mind taking a second to follow Inquiries of Our Reality on Instagram and Facebook, and Open Minds Media on YouTube and TikTok, I'd greatly appreciate it. And feel free to spark up a conversation. I love getting to know you guys. And now back to the show.
So that's when I really started to do more paranormal along with my history stuff.
Say, honestly, they go hand in hand. Like you were kind of saying, as soon as you start diving into one, you start falling into the other one, because some of the history is almost like hidden within like the folklore / paranormal stories of the area. And you were mentioning earlier that you had actually spent the night on some of these battlefields. And of course, you'd mentioned this last apparition you'd actually seen. But back when you were, sleeping on the battlefields, did you get the opportunity to see any like ghostly figures or anything like that?
I never saw any ghostly figures. I have heard what was known as the long roll, and that is in the morning when an army was getting ready to move out for the day to join into a battle. Around 3 or 4 a.m., they would get all the drummers' boys up, and if there was a hill or a knoll nearby, they would put them up on it, and it was just a long roll. And I actually, along with about 10 or 12 other guys, one morning at Antietam, heard the long roll at about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And we didn't have a drummer boy with us, and there would have probably had to been 10 or 15 to have that kind of sound out of it. And, as I say, the night rangers would come down. They won't admit to the public, and I found this out a long time ago. Officially, a lot of the federal government employees that work for the Park Service will tell you that the Park Service does not recognize the existence of spirits. And, the day I talked at the show, but if you get them out with their family on a Friday night in their civvies, and they're sitting there having their meal, and they recognize you, and you sit down to talk to them, they're going to admit at least one thing that they either heard or saw on the battlefield at night. And I get it. They don't want a lot of people traipsing through there because it's hollowed ground. And I remember when I was there as a volunteer, and that would have been 40 years ago, they had an original limber that sat right out in front of the visitor center. They couldn't trace it to the Battle of Antietam, but it would have been in the Civil War. And it disappeared one weekend. And when they found it, some guys had stolen it. It must have took about 20 of them to pick this thing up. And they had lined it with styrofoam and made a giant beer cooler out of it.
Wow.
So they're not going to, because of things like that, they don't want a lot of people on the battlefield at night. And I totally understand. But there are some things that go on there. Charlie King, who is the youngest person to be killed in the American Civil War with the 49th Pennsylvania Regiment, who was their drummer boy.
How old was he?
A little over 13. Beg pardon?
I was asking how old he was.
13 years old.
13.
Part of some shrapnel from an artillery round came in and struck him in the chest. They carried him to the rear to an aid station. He died 2 days later. That would have been in the area around what's known as the North Woods. There's still people to this day that say that they've been out there reading monuments and walking the battlefield up in that area. And I haven't heard it, but I've talked to people who claim they have, and you hear a drummer boy playing. And everybody always has said it's got to be Charlie King, which is sad, very sad.
Kind of makes you wonder, because when you start diving into the paranormal stuff, you get into this whole idea between like intelligent and residual, and it's like in cases like that, you really hope that it's the residual stuff, that it's just a traumatic event that happens to echo, and there's not actually like a conscious spirit there. Like hopefully that boy ended up moving on to the afterlife in some way, shape, or form, and it's just that residual sound that's always going to stick because of it. Just, I guess a lot of people have different theories on how it happens, but the one that I kind of tend to lean towards is the whole like stone tape theory, where it's basically like, works almost like how a VHS tape would work, that when you have this magnetic area, that things will basically just collect into it and end up replaying.
I refer to it by something much older. Back in my day, we still had record players and records. It's the broken record. It just keeps turning.
That's actually, I haven't heard that expression before, but it definitely fits.
Yeah, it's like a broken record. And the saddest part of this whole story is that regiment had heard him playing a drum, and they sent officers over and talked his mother and father into letting him enlist and promised nothing would happen to him. And a year later, he was dead. And the story that I like to hit on is, Screaming Jenny's. We talked about this too at the show. Screaming Jenny's there at Harper's Ferry. That happened shortly after the Civil War. The town of Harper's Ferry was hit pretty hard by the war. In fact, very hard. And actually, it started with John Brown's raid in 1859 in October. But there were a good bit of a shanty town down along the railroad tracks. Supposedly, she set her dress on fire from her stove trying to cook a meal in her little shanty. And she was going up the railroad track screaming for help when the night train, which most of the time was the Wheeling Special, which would arrive at Harper's Ferry roughly around 11 p.m., struck and killed her. And I've never researched this story, but I've heard it so much that I've just taken it for granted over the years that the story was true. I can tell you that I had several friends over the years that worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, aka as it went over into the Chessie system, which would have been 70s, 80s. And there were guys who would mark off on a foggy night going through Harper's Ferry, which the run would be from Brunswick, Maryland. You cross into West Virginia, come to Martinsburg, cross back into Maryland, and go on to Cumberland. And these guys, they had seen it, and they would mark off. They would call, that's fancy railroad term for calling in sick. They didn't want to make that run that night because they had seen it before. Harper's Ferry, to my knowledge, that's the first ghost tour in the United States. Miss Shirley Daughtery started it sometime in the 70s. And it still goes on to this day. I'm very biased, of course, because I'm from Jefferson County. I think that's the most haunted place in the country. I really do. It's had a lot of tragedy, not only with John Brown's raid and the Civil War, but you have some railroad accidents, you've had flood, just the whole genre of things that have happened there, that I sincerely believe that Harper's Ferry is the most haunted place in the country.
I mean, honestly, it seems like that whole area, because, you have Middleway right there, too, that has its whole haunted history with, like, Wizard Clip and everything. That's honestly, that whole area.
Yes. The Wizard's Clip, when I was a little boy in the 70s, early, mid-70s at Ranson Elementary School, every Halloween, and I don't care if you were in the first grade or the sixth grade, that was part of your Halloween party, was the teacher would retell the wizard clip. So I heard that for 6 years, and that stuck with me. Um, I've done some research on that, and I did find out that it is true that Livingston did deed 30 some odd acres of his property to the Catholic Church so they could have a father stay in the Middle Way area. Of course, at that point in time, it's Smithfield. So, yeah, and the part of the property that was donated is where Priestfield is today, where the Strangers is buried at. So I think that story has a lot of complexity to it, but I think also at the same time, I think there's a lot of truth to that story. I understand if you go to the Catholic Church, which would be the fledgling American Catholic Church in 1794, one of the first recorded hauntings they got is the Livingston Farm at Smithfield, Virginia, the Wizard Clip.
I was gonna say,
So,
I've always heard that was one of the first American poltergeist stories, other than
yes.
than the Bell Witch, which I don't know exactly which one happened before, but obviously they're both some of the very first American poltergeist stories.
I think the Bell Witch which was in Tennessee, that would have happened in, I believe, the 1820s or 1830s. In fact, I'm leaning towards about middle ground here, the late 1820s, early 1830s, because as I recall, she had a little bit of a get together one night with Andrew Jackson, who was president of the United States. He was going through and didn't believe, and she stopped the horses, and the horses wouldn't move. This is some story I'd read someplace. And after some begging and pleading with the Bell Witch by the driver of the stage, President Jackson was allowed to go on. So I think actually Wizard Clip is a little bit older.
Oh, that's even cooler then, because the Wizard Clip story, it's one of those things that it's it seems like it's a very folklore-y story, but like you were kind of saying, the more you dive into it, the more you realize that there's all these connecting pieces. So it's when it's stuff, you start talking about stuff from the 1700s, everybody kind of has that biblical perspective on things. So it's kind of hard to separate what was actually happening versus what may have been something that was just people kind of getting scared at the time. But the whole it clipping stuff out of people's pockets and all these crazy stories about these women coming into the house then leaving, and then they'll have a handkerchief in their pocket and they'll open it up and it'll have the moon cut into it and stuff
Well, there's two sides to that story. I'm glad you brought that up. One version has the young lady with the fancy handkerchief that was sent, that she had gotten from either France or England, and it was cut with a half moon. The other one is a rich little old lady from the Bunker Hill area who had came and spent the day with the Livingstons, ha and poo-pooed that there wasn't any such thing as spirits, spent the entire day there. Now, as you get into this story with her in it, it talks about how she had a beautiful hat that she had ordered from France or England, and that when she got there, she had her coachman and her footman get her hat box down and put the hat, no use taking a big chance here.
Yeah.
I'm going to put my hat in the box. And she goes in, spends the day with the Adams, with the Livingston's family. Nothing happens, doesn't hear anything, no clippings down. They fed her meals, the whole 9 yards. That afternoon, she's like, see ya, I told you. She goes out, they put her back in her coach. They're going down the Smithfield Turnpike, which is today Route 51. She realizes, I should put my new hat back on. When she opens the hat box up, it's cut full of half moons. So I've heard the young lady with the handkerchief, but I've also heard this older lady with this hat. So it can go, and all these stories have little variations. But I've heard the one, and I think the one that was told at Ranson School by the different teachers every year back in the 70s was the lady with the hat, but I've also heard the younger lady with the handkerchief.
Hold on, guys. We have to take a break to pay some bills. But if you don't like hearing the ads, then I have a solution for you. You can get ad-free and early access to this show and Bizarre Encounters with Shayn Orin on the Open Minds Media Patreon for just $1 a month. It's a great way to support the show and all the hard work behind it. And if you're interested in merch store discounts or video versions of the show, then there are a few other tiers with additional benefits with 7-day free trials available. And we are back, so let's hop right in. And that's one of those ones, too, that, I mean, both of those stories could have theoretically happened. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell once you get to the point where, like, a bunch of people are actually coming and going from that place, because then it's kind of like everything kind of gets lost. Because I know, like, right. Jessie doing a lot of, like, the research for the place, like, she was collecting a lot of this stuff from, like, family stories. So it's like, of course, with, like, family stories, you know, when it passes down a couple generations, some people will start kind of adding a couple little extra details to it. And you kind of, you know that the truth's in there somewhere, but you know that there's also these little extra bells and whistles along with the story.
And you know, as a story gets passed down through the generations, there's always something that happens. Somebody doesn't quite remember the way the original story was, and they got something in their head, and it goes from a young lady with a handkerchief to an older lady with a fancy hat. But it's still the same story, and it's still the same principle. You know, the handkerchief was in a purse or a pocket. The hat was left out in the coach in a hat box where it should have been safe. And so was the handkerchief. But yet the spirit with the invisible scissors, or shears as they were known, still got it. And I think that's fascinating. I love that. But now I usually tell that story around Halloween for my Halloween tour, even though I'm in Charlestown. And I always end with it. And I always, because of my upbringing with the story, I tell about the lady with the hat. And I've had some people say, no, it's a young lady with a handkerchief. I'm like, well, it could be her or it could be the lady with the hat. It's one or the other. I've heard both stories.
Could be both.
Yeah, I've heard both versions.
And of course, because we brought up Snarly Yow a little bit earlier in the show, his whole thing is he wanted to kind of bring back a bit of the folklore as far as like Snarly Yow goes. But right. Living in the area when you were a kid, did you hear any stories about ghostly black dogs or anything?
Yes, over around South Mountain. Yes, I knew some people who had been over in that area. Of course, it wasn't nearly as populated as it is today. That's part of the battlefield of the Battle of South Mountain, which preceded Antietam by just a couple of days. So yes, I've heard about that black dog up there a few times. I never witnessed it. I've heard some older people around town when I was a boy talk about that, and most of them. Have you ever heard about that dog up there on South Mountain? That big black dog, you know? And I would sit there, you know, just intently and listen to what these grown-ups had to say back and forth. And I don't know. I guess I was lucky that I was able to retain information like that. Most of the stuff, if I write it down one time, I'm good. And yes, I have heard stories about that dog up on South Mountain. And then Spook Hill, which is basically in the same area where, you know, the Confederates were pushing the cannons up during the Battle of South Mountain. And if you go up there at night and put your car in neutral and put talcum powder all over the trunk lid, the car will actually go uphill by itself. And when you get to the top, there should be handprints in the powder on the trunk lid.
Oh, that's super
in fact,
cool.
That was on in the 70s or 80s on Ripley's Believe It or Not, when they still had that TV show. That was on TV at least once that I can remember, because I remember we tuned in special just to watch that episode to see that.
What was the result? Did they end up like showing it on the show? Did it work for them?
You know, that's been so long ago, I don't rightly remember, but I can tell you that some people have kind of sort of said it's an optical illusion. They couldn't explain the fingerprints, but that actually you were going downhill and not up. So but I've known people, who went over there as young people when we were in high school. I didn't, but I knew some people who did that went over there and tried it out and swore they didn't put the powder on the back of the truck or the car, but they swore the vehicle moved by itself. But Snarly, and going back to Screaming Jenny, when him and I first started about talking about the folklore, and he said, well, Screaming Jenny's is down here next to Jefferson High School, down that little community called Duffield. And I bust out laughing. I said, yes and no. And he said, what do you mean, yes and no? I said, well, the Screaming Jenny's in Harper's Ferry is the story. The Screaming Jenny's in Duffield was dreamed up by a bunch of farm boys at Jefferson High School to take young girls out there at night on a Friday and Saturday night and scare them half to death. Because there was an old house out there. It's still there. If you're going from Jefferson, you'll go through the big S curve. You get to the railroad tracks. There's a park and ride on the left where you catch train into the city. If you look up those tracks towards Chandor Junction on the right-hand side, there's an old farmhouse. That is the Screaming Jenny's of Jefferson High School. That's where you would park, take 3 or 4 young ladies up there. Your buddy was up in the attic, pots and pans, the chain, and they would clean house going up the railroad tracks back to that truck. And that was just something that was dreamed up by a bunch of guys to scare girls. That I never had heard that until I got to Jefferson in the fall of 1980 and got immersed into the school culture. And everybody's talking about Screaming Jenny's right down the road. And I'm like, but no, that's Harper's Ferry. And one guy finally said, no, it's down here. Trust me. And that's when I began to realize what was going on, that it was just a place to take girls and scare them.
That seems to be something that probably happens with a lot of these paranormal stories, because it's like you hear about like the weeping woman, the woman in the white next to the rivers, like all this kind of stuff. I'm sure that it probably had one area that there was a story that this happened in, and then it just branched from town to town to town with people spreading the folklore into their town and fitting it in. And now it's kind of like you have this thing that exists everywhere, but it has this one main focal point that it started in, because I'm sure if you start diving around that area, there's probably more Screaming Jenny stories in different areas.
A woman in white. Every story like that I've ever heard, the woman is always dressed in white. The big one that I've always heard was up there in the Spangler Springs area of the Gettysburg battlefield. Supposedly you can see her at night, and she was a jilted lover, I think, engaged, and the guy didn't show up at the wedding or something like that. And she's supposed to be weeping and dressed in a long white gown. And I'm with you. I think that just marches. It just goes from one place to another.
Or it's just one weird sighting, and then people start connecting it with other folklore, which is like, I think that there's definitely something possible that could be happening in all these different areas, but people like to try to explain something that's unexplainable with something that seems relatively familiar. So the next thing you know, you have this like white woman in a dress sighting, and then all of a sudden it pulls on the story from the next town, and it takes somebody that really does the research to start to like dissect it and say, oh, here's this other case over here where there was a woman who, maybe drown her kids. That's another one that seems to pop in with a lot of these stories too.
Yes.
But there will be like these different things that'll happen in these different towns that are very similar, and then they all start to kind of like blend together after a certain point. But I mean, maybe that's clearly like an archetype of becoming a ghost is, of course there's like the massive trauma aspect that we kind of talked about earlier, but if you lose somebody that you're desperately in love with, be it, your lover not showing up to a wedding or your kids or something like that, like it's going to cause something residual. And that's where you hear all of these stories about these like women that are ghostly women looking for something, like searching for something.
Yes, searching for something. And I think you hit it on the head. Most of the time in a situation like that, whether it's a woman who's searching or longing for something, or a young soldier, it was something unfulfilled. Something that really just devastated their lives or took their life. And I think that's where you get a lot of the residual hauntings is from a spirit that it just jolted them to the core. And it's funny we're having this conversation about the lady in white because I was just watching Mysterious WV on YouTube. McCracken gentleman, very nice guy. He usually does murder mysteries, unsolved murders throughout the state of West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
But every year on Halloween, he puts together a little Halloween video. And one of them is out next to Parkersburg, and it's a woman in white who was struck by a train because her lover had jolted her at the altar. And supposedly for years, these engineers, as they were getting ready to enter tunnel number 19, I think it was, they would see this lady in white, and just as they were about to hit her, she would shoot straight up in the air. And then you would hear this ungodly scream. He did the research and could never find anything about a lady being struck by a train in that area. Supposedly the body laid for a couple of years in a ravine. They finally found her. They had a service. They buried her. They couldn't find out what her name was. Supposedly she's buried in an unmarked grave in one of the local cemeteries. But they all have that one thing in common. There was a terrible thing that happened to them. And, white is a symbol of purity. And I think that has a lot to do with the story as well. She's always wearing white because she was this wonderful person, so to speak, and she has been done wrong. And in the end, she is suffering through eternity for it. It grabbed her so much, and it made her so sad and so angry that she's going to suffer through eternity because of it. And I think here again we talk about how the stories kind of march along, or they go from town to town. I think that's part of it as well. I think that's why she's always wearing a white dress, except for the one out in California. I don't remember the story very well, but that lady wears a gray dress. I've heard that story before, too. I just don't remember very much of it.
Which could be a dirty white. So, I mean, it still could even be a shade of white in a weird way.
Maybe she fell on the beach. Who knows?
Or she was buried for so long, something like that,
Right.
Don't go anywhere, guys. We'll be right back. But just a quick reminder, if you'd like to rock some gear for one of your favorite podcasts, creatures, or topics, hop on over to the Open Minds Media store on Etsy and Printify for a wide range of designs with new drops regularly. The most recent design available is the SQUATCH Country Fear and Loathing parody design, with Sasquatch as Hunter S. Thompson and Mothman as Dr. Gonzo, with artwork by Chris Holm of the Conspire Theory podcast. Welcome back to the show. Now let's dive right in. And I guess because we were talking about it a little bit earlier in the show too, with all your research into like history, Civil War stuff specifically, when a lot of people dive into the stuff in your area, it's usually like all the Civil War stuff. But coming in from like a Civil War soldier's perspective, have you happened to dive around or dig around and find any stories that maybe some of the Civil War soldiers would talk about at the time, like creature sightings, like ghostly sightings, anything like that?
There were several Ohio soldiers camped on Maryland Heights in 1861. That would be where the railroad tunnel is today. It was a rainy night. It seems that it always is.
Always.
Always. And I have heard of this happening. They're fresh off of a farm. They don't know a whole lot. And they wanted to build a campfire. And, to build a fire pit, you need rocks. But if you don't have rocks and there's cannonballs laying around, just build it out of cannonballs. And, they had built this fire. and it was ringed in cannonballs. And once they all get up there real good, well, of course, what happens? Those cannonballs cooked off. And supposedly, as the war progressed, and they were called the Ohio men or the Ohio boys, there were reports of a great big flash up on the mountain every so often on rainy nights. I can tell you the weirdest one I ever heard was the one about George Washington leading part of the Union Army during the Battle of Gettysburg. And I understand you can go to the National Archives, and there are reports filed by several Union and Confederate officers that claim that during part of the battle, Washington rode up on that white charger, that all the paintings of him from the Revolution, and actually led part of the Union Army to victory. Now, I've never researched it, but I understand from what I've watched and what I've been told that there are documents in the National Archives from veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg that claim that it really happened.
Do people end up seeing any type of like well, I feel like it'd be residual if anything, but has anybody reported seeing like George Washington or his white horse or anything like that on the battlefield at any point?
That's the only story about Gettysburg and George Washington I've ever heard.
Because I feel like that would be, because one thing I kind of debate back and forth with on the show is the whole idea about people think that these hauntings happen because of a traumatic event, but I think it can also happen with an influx of emotion both ways, because my argument for this is usually like saloon music that people hear. I feel like so many people had a good time there that you're not hearing the music because of something bad that happened there, but because there was just such an amounting of energy of just good, positive, happy things that happened there. So that being said, in that situation, you know, if George Washington came and actually like led these people into victory, that's like a happy, traumatic, like, or not traumatic, but happy, like enthusiastic, like let's root, let's go do it type of the situation. So yeah, I'm kind of curious if maybe there have been any sightings of this, if it was something that has been somewhat proven to have happened.
Right. And you know, since Washington is the father of our country, he led the Revolutionary War Army. In a way, it's like saying that, you know, I built this republic, and now I've come back to save this republic. And again, I've not researched it a great deal, but it is my understanding that in the archives in D.C. there are some paper trails. And of course, you know, anytime you have an event such as Gettysburg, which was a 3-day battle, the largest battle on the North American continent, or you have Antietam, which was only a 12-hour battle, but it's the bloodiest battle in the history of this country. In 12 hours, there's 23,300 casualties. You know, that's more than Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and 9/11 all put together.
I don't think people take into consideration like how their medical stuff was back then too, because it was like if you got shot, you were either losing a limb or you were getting an infection, and a lot of the time, if they had to just cut the limb off because they wouldn't just pull the bullets out back then you'd probably still die from an infection. So it was like you got shot and it was almost like a death sentence, no matter, even if you got shot in the shoulder.
And you know, you hit a good nail on the head going over to the history part. There were more soldiers killed in the Civil War from disease than there were from wounds.
That's not a surprising number at all, considering like the camps and how dirty they probably were, and the fact that they had very minimal supplies. Like, yeah.
But I've often wondered if most of Antietam isn't just because of the ferocity of the battle, that if all the spirits at Antietam is just one large residual haunting, it's just that broken record. It just keeps playing.
I mean, I wouldn't even be surprised if it's almost the whole state of West Virginia at this point, considering how much different stuff is happening. But, I mean, you dive into that. I mean, you guys got a lot of different types of mining, so there's a lot of different types of minerals and materials and stuff in that earth underneath that would not be surprised at all if it just holds everything in that happens in West Virginia.
Well, that's true. Of course, Antietam's in Maryland, but you are right. You are right. And, look at the amount of mine disasters we've had in this state. And railroad accidents. Those two things alone. Oh, and then, at one point in time, we were very big. Well, we still are, but we're very big in the logging industry. You got a lot, those are three very dangerous occupations. They're bad enough now, but 100 and some odd years ago, they were 100 times worse than they are now. So you have a large amount of deaths from those. And I think that here again, it just keeps playing itself over and over again. And in some cases, I honestly believe that they are actually trying. If you're out cutting down a tree and you see something that looks like a logger from the past with the axe and he disappears on you, to me, he got killed. And he's trying to warn you to be real careful about how you're cutting this tree down. Because it's going to end up, if you're not real careful, it could end up happening to you.
Waking up the haunting, actually, because it's like reoccurring event and it knows that reoccurring event's going to happen again. So it's like...
Yeah, and then both of us can walk together and, warn some other poor soul.
Hey, maybe that's all they need to do, and maybe after that they can move on to the afterlife. They just have to warn one person and save one person. So, I mean, maybe you should take that ghost's advice, because maybe you'll be the one that ends up making it so he can pass into the other side.
True. That could be. But you are right. This state, but with the caverns, especially here in Jefferson County, the caverns that we have under Charlestown, Lakeland Cavern, just the size of this thing. It starts roughly on Main Street and it goes all the way out into Rance in the southern states. That's a mile. Now, how far it goes long ways, I do not know. But I've always heard that limestone and water carry and hold a lot of spiritual activity. And, after growing up here and living here my whole entire life, I have a tendency to believe that's the truth.
Hey, maybe that's why a lot of these stories start off with a stormy night, is it actually has something to do with the water actually stirring up the residual haunting.
It very well may. It very well. And you are right. I mean, if you hear 10 ghost stories, at least 6 to 8 of them, it was a dark and stormy night. And there's usually a stranger involved. Like with the Wizard clip, there was a stranger involved. It's usually a traveler. They're stopping someplace. They're going to spend the night. And the person that they meet in the house that lets them in, they're so nice, and they fixed them a warm meal, and they gave them coffee, and they got them a bed. And then the next morning they get up, and there's nobody there. That story's happened a lot. I've heard different variations throughout the country on that particular story, where the traveler would stop and knock on the door, flat tire or lame horse, whatever. And it seems like it was usually a young lady, and she didn't speak to very much, if at all. And she would beckon them to come in, and the hot coffee and a sandwich, and, sleep on the couch here, and it's going to be fine. And they would go upstairs, and the next morning when this person awoke, there was nobody there. And of course, the average person, if there's a town nearby, you're going to go into town, you're going to say, hey man, I spent the night at this house out here on the road, a big 2-story, what? You couldn't have spent the night there. Nobody's lived there in 30 years. That seems to be a pretty prevalent story too. The traveler who goes to the house on a dark, stormy night because of a flat tire or a lame horse. There's a young woman involved. They fed him. They gave him a place to sleep. And the next day, it couldn't have happened because nobody has lived in this house for 30 some odd, 40 some odd years. But they claim that it did, happened that very night before. I've read a lot of those stories.
I mean, it honestly fits in with the type of people in the area, because if you got like all the trains, you got the miners, you have the loggers, they're all people that, there's the people that are always going to be there. And then there's a lot of people that travel around in those industries more so. Trains obviously are always moving, but like logging, mining, you always have those new workers coming in. So, I mean, just the spreading of the stories also, I feel kind of fits in with that whole like traveler stranger concept, because that's how all these stories have spread. And also on the other weird way of doing it, like you're explaining, it's also started a bunch of stories because of people letting somebody in their house, and then it creating this like residual type of scenario.
Yes. There's also been, and I'm sure you've heard a few of these too. The hitchhiker. Yep. The hitchhiker that they would pick up on the road, and you're driving down the road and you're talking to this person that's sitting in the passenger seat. And I want to go to such and such a house on such and such street. And when you pull up in front of the house, here nobody there. Here you are. You want to say here you are, but there's nobody there. We have one of those not too terribly far away. It's actually in Virginia. It's in Clark County. It's up near the government facility at Bluemont. We just celebrated the first of the month, the 50th anniversary of that jet that crashed into the mountain up there and killed everybody. I want to say 75 or 80 people. I've heard stories about truckers who were getting back in their rig at a truck stop on the Dulles Airport side of the mountain. Guy out there alongside the road, uniform, the wings. I gotta get to Dulles Airport. Can you please get me to Dulles Airport? Well, yeah, man, I gotta go right past there. Hop on in here. And they're tooling down the road in this semi truck, and they're talking. And all of a sudden, he says something, and there's no answer. He looks over, and the cab is empty.
Those are such scary stories, but so fascinating. Like, I would love to just like experience that, just to sit in that situation.
Yes, that always was an interesting story to me. I couldn't believe it. Of course, it'd been years since I'd been up there. I was up there about 4 years after it happened. My dad took me up there. You could still see where that, I want to say it was 747, where it had come in, and just the trees were just getting shorter as they came up the mountain. And it hit right at the entrance to that government facility up there. And it was a rock that's probably as big as a semi truck, and it actually drove it into the mountain about 8 inches.
Whew.
The thing that fascinated me was that when I was back up there just a few years ago for the first time in eons, somebody had purchased all that land and were building houses on it for people to live in. And I guarantee you they don't know what happened there.
I don't know if it's in West Virginia or in any of the states in your area, but I know that there are a few states where you actually have to let people know the paranormal history of the house, not because the state recognizes it, but just because they know that it's going to play a factor in resale value later on. So I'm kind of curious if in that area, if they would have to inform people about it, or if it's one of those things that it didn't happen in the house, so it kind of falls into a gray area, that if it's the land, it's, it's not technically this house.
I got to be honest with you. I don't know. I don't know how West Virginia does that. I can tell you, of course, we were such a small community at one time. There were some houses in our area, where people would say, wouldn't live in that house. Old man so-and-so died in that house, or what have you. But I don't know how the state of West Virginia handles that. I don't. And you are right. I have heard of that before, where you have to discuss if there's any hauntings or poltergeist in your home before you can sell it to somebody else. And I find that within itself fascinating, that there's kind of a law out there. And this aggravates me. You have some entities, like, say, these certain states, that are actually recognizing that there is such a thing. And then you have other groups who say that it doesn't exist. And I'm old school. There's no gray area here. It's either a straight line. It can be a little curvy, but, it's like this. And there's no right or left. It's this way. And, sometimes you get some people, it doesn't exist, and other people, like you say, if you're going to tell these people your home and you claim it's haunted, you got to tell them about it. And that's a little bit rough for me. I just go on and admit to it. Just like
it might add more resale to it, because there are a lot of people that are interested in that stuff.
Sure. Some of the UFO sightings in this country, and Project Blue Book, and what have you, and all the years that the government, oh no, and now all of a sudden you're seeing all this video footage from these different Navy fighter planes and everything of stuff that you can't explain. And now they're finally saying, yeah, we've been researching this stuff for years. We've been seeing it. Well, why are you covering it up?
They're even trying to call it UAPs instead of UFOs, so it kind of separates it a little bit in people's minds.
Right. To me, it makes it worse when you get caught covering it up and then admit to it than it does if you just come out and say, yeah, because I don't know about you, but and I think it's a common problem we have in this country now. Nobody trusts the government. Nope. Well, when you have things like that, how can you? You and I saw something in the sky. Oh, it was an airplane. No, it wasn't an airplane. An airplane don't go like this, And then when they're boxed in and they finally admit to it, why didn't you just admit to it in the first place? So,
now it's like most of ufology doesn't want to believe any of the stuff coming out from the government. It's like any other time you would have been like, oh yeah, like the government's admitting this, like this is awesome. But now it's like all the UFO guys are like, nope, I don't believe it.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. But before we get into this break, if you might be interested in joining a growing community of like-minded individuals, then pop on over to the Open Minds Media Telegram, a place to discuss high strangeness, conspiracies, and anything else on your mind. Bizarre and open-minded individuals always welcome. Link to join available down in the show description. And we are back, so let's get back to it. But I guess kind of starting to wrap up towards the end. This has, of course, been a wonderful conversation. I always like to do words of wisdom from the guest to the listener. So if there's any words of wisdom you might want to bestow on the listeners today, what might it be?
If you're going to research the paranormal, and I mentioned this to you at that show, you have to research the history first. Mm-hmm. Like we've been talking, it meshes. Know what you're talking about. Know what the area was like at the point in time you think this residual or haunting is from. Going back to Screaming Jenny's in Harper's Ferry, the railroad train station where it sits today, it was further up towards the river. It was moved down to there in 1891. Actually, Screaming Jenny, where she should have been struck and killed, was roughly in the area where the train station is today. What happened was the old way that the railroad laid was they came up around Maryland Heights because there was no railroad tunnel, curved like this, and then a hard left curve onto the bridge. And then when they came across the bridge, it was a hard right turn up through Harper's Ferry to go on towards Martinsburg. Well, they began to have problems, especially in that hard right turn in Harper's Ferry at the train station. The engines would flip. They were starting to get the longer wheelbases. They would flip. So that's why you now have the tunnel. And that's why the station sits where it does, because they moved the station on further up and they put a big floating curve in there. So when you go to research something that's paranormal, my advice to you is to find out what the history of the area is like also, because it will help you to understand it.
You may have me looking in completely the wrong area if you don't know the actual history.
Exactly. And I'm guilty of it too. We've all been there.
Hey, and that's how you learn, though. Sometimes you got to make mistakes, but that's how you end up learning from it, though.
True.
And if anybody wanted to come and book a tour with you, they possibly even wanted to share some of their stories, if they happen to be locals in the area or anything, where can people come and find your tours, and where can people possibly contact you on the internet?
Well, my phone number is 304-261-5416. And my email address is all lowercase, kevinbreeden64@gmail. I am currently working on a Facebook business page, but at this point in time, just the phone number or the email address. And to tell you the God's honest truth, I've had good business just through word of mouth. People coming to me.
Stay tuned, guys. This is our last break. But if you guys enjoyed the show and think I deserve it, please leave a review or rating for the show on iTunes or Spotify. Your continued support is what makes this show possible, and your opinions go a long way to help the show grow and improve. So thank you. Now back with that deep conversation you crave.
When the weather gets warm, I'm sure at least 1 or 2 Saturdays a month, you'll see me just wandering through the cemetery, notebook in hand. There's still some people I'm looking for to put on, not for paranormal, but for history. I'm still soul searching for. And the records at Edge Hill are iffy. So it's actually easier for me to get out and just walk it. And you know how it goes. I'm looking for you, but I find these 2 other guys while I'm doing it. And I'm like, I got 3 now, But yeah, the phone number or the email address would be the best way to go right now. And then, I'll get back with you sometime whenever I get the Facebook page set up.
And I'll make sure I include that down in the show description. So whenever you get it added, I'll go back and end up adding it back onto here. So hopefully, if people are listening to this later on, the link should already be down there by then. But next time I come out to West Virginia, I know I'll be out there every year for Snarly Owl's Cryptid Halloween. So I'll have to make sure that we set up a tour so I can go and check out these areas and check out your tour, because I'd love to check it out.
I'd love to take you out sometime. And if you like history, I can take you out for one of those too.
Oh, I'll do 2 birds, 1 stone. I'm down for both.
Good. You man after my own heart. That's the way I am too. I like them both.
I really, really appreciate you making the time to come on today. I appreciate this being your first podcast. Hopefully it was a good experience for you, because I definitely love this conversation.
Oh, me too. I very much enjoyed it. And sometime if you want to run your mouth with me again, just let me know. We'll set up another one.
Absolutely. You're always welcome on the show, my friend.
Well, I appreciate that, sir.
If you enjoyed today's episode and want to show some love for the show, don't forget to smash that follow icon, or you guys can even share this episode or the whole show with a friend through word of mouth. Of course, an awesome way to help the show grow through grassroots. And if anyone would like to get in touch with me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through the email, which is inquiries-of-all-reality-podcast@outlook.com, or through social media. Instagram and Facebook are the ones that I'm the most active on. Or you guys can also get a hold of me through the submission form, which is available on the link tree, of course. Or you guys can even call into the hotline, text the hotline if you guys want to, leave a voicemail, whatever you guys want to do. And that number is 313-364-1551. And if you guys have some free time, don't forget to check out some of the awesome friends of the show. I Know Squatch, Snarly Owl Natural Products, Cryptotheology, and Big Ape Threads. And our other friends with affiliate links, Dimension Devices, Oregon-ite, and Sticker Mule, with additional discounts and credits available. And more info on that, of course, is available down in the show description. And every single thing that I mentioned throughout the show today is all available on the link tree, which is available down in that show description also. And with that, I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. I hope today's show's connected some dots in your own reality. And I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey, with a mic talking about philosophy. Well, was stalking campers as a Wendigo walks through the woods of sharpened antlers, using a Ouija board to talk to the dead like a necromancer. There's so many questions and not enough answers. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities, tune in and listen to Inquiries of Our Reality. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities, tune in and listen to Inquiries